Is America experiencing a turning point in the transgender battle? We're going to be talking about that and more on today's show here on Higher Ground. I am joined by my friend Brandon Showalter. He is with the Christian Post. How you doing, Brandon?
Hi, Billy. Good to be with you today.
You and I have had a lot of really interesting conversations lately because there's a lot going on when it comes to this transgender battle. You have your podcast, Generation Indoctrination, season 3 that just dropped, and we're going to talk about the show. But I've got to start here because one of the things about this transgender issue that has been so interesting, it felt like for a long time, people were just kind of looking the other way, going along with it, the pronouns, all these things that have sort of happened around the ideology that have permeated so much of culture. Again, people have just sort of gone with it, but it feels like people are starting to dig in their heels and push back, not just Christians, even people outside of the religious sphere. What have you seen when it comes to sort of that dynamic?
For sure. Well, I think so much of the corporate press has preferred to frame this issue as yet another chapter in sort of the hot button touchy culture wars between very left wing secular people and right wing religious people. And in fact, today I've got a review of a book by a stalwart radical feminist Democrat, The Reckoning, Kara Dansky. And she's been one of the most bold and outspoken voices on the scene and has been for years. So the truth of the matter is that there have been leftists who have been paving the way and blazing the trail for a long time, even before many of the more conservative Christian and religious folks started engaging the issue. So there's some complicated and interesting history to be told there, and people can read that review of her book, The Reckoning, if they go to ChristianPost.com. Just went live today. Here it is on Tuesday, the February 13th. But regardless, you're correct that this is an unconventional issue because Americans across the board, whether they're on the left or the right, are not liking what they're seeing with this movement to drug and surgically operate on children who are psychologically distressed. I think that's the worst, most egregious harm of transgender ideology. Of course, a lot of people also have great distaste for males who pretend to be women to invade women's sports or their prisons or every other area of culture. I think because this issue contravenes reality at such a deep and basic level, it people just can't go along with this, religious or not. And so I think we're finally starting to puncture the prevailing corporate press narrative that this is just another right versus left fight, when in fact the truth is more complicated. Because I think the harms are now unignorable. As further evidence of that, Pamela Paul of the New York Times had an amazing column a few days ago that outlined and delineated a lot of the concerns that many people on the left have been expressing for years, but they just haven't been able to be heard so much in an outlet like the New York Times. So things are changing, the winds are shifting, the tide is turning, but we have to continue to be diligent and vigilant because the transgender activists that have forced this dogma through the culture are not going to down without a brutal fight.
Well, and you mentioned a couple of things there that I think are important to just, underscore. And obviously the children, who are being transitioned, that is an issue that a lot of people, do not like. Obviously, they feel like it is evil and they would like to see it stop happening. And that's not just Christians, but there were two other issues you mentioned when you talk about women's sports, right? And the fact that you could be a total secularist or a liberal and whatever you believe, and think, oh my goodness, there should not be biological men competing with women in sports. And so, as you were saying, these issues, they really do cross into a variety of areas of life that affect everyone, not just people with religious sensibilities, not just Christians who have a biblical worldview, but really everyone. The other issue you mentioned, and I just want to talk about it for a minute because I think it's really important, and you have covered this in Generation Indoctrination, but people don't think about this: women's prisons.
Mm-hmm.
If a biological man in some areas, like let's say California, identifies as a woman and wants to be put into a women's prison, talk a little bit about what happens there and what you've heard from some of the people who have fallen victim to some of this.
Well, that's right, Billy. We actually did interview in season 3 Amy Ichikawa, who was a part of season one in the bonus episode. That the bonus episode in season one was all about this issue of prisons, but in episode two of season three, we revisited that issue because it's in California, which I believe is the epicenter of transgender ideology and activism in the United States. And in the state of California, Gavin Newsom signed a law sponsored by Senator Scott Wiener, who's one of the most fervent uh, fervent proponents of gender ideology in the whole country. Senate Bill 132, he made it such that all a man had to do was merely claim to be female, and through the corrections department in California, they could transfer into a women's prison. Now, I'm a human rights guy, and I know that this statute doesn't apply domestically, but the Geneva Convention forbids the housing of males and females together in the same prison quarters in a context of war. But that's a standard that I think, Billy, should certainly apply here. And so what you have is predators, sexual offenders, and this has happened in the United States, not just in California, but all over the country, where these male offenders have been sexually assaulting women in prison. There was even a case in New Jersey where it was said that a woman impregnated another woman in the prison. Well, it was a woman who claimed to be a man because it's impossible for two women to impregnate each other. I mean, we are far beyond Orwell in this country, especially on this, but the women in prison don't have much of a voice. They are a truly marginalized community that has been further harmed by this dogma. It's absolutely atrocious what these poor women in prison, many of whom have histories of domestic violence and substance abuse and alcohol addiction. And the prison has been, until for most of them, for many of them, the only safe place they have ever had. And so now it's being invaded by these predators who merely claim to be female. And just to underscore the point, even Dana Rivers, he's a guilty of a triple homicide. He savagely murdered a lesbian couple and their adopted son back in 2016. And earlier, a few months ago, he was transferred into a women's prison. They actually did it. Someone who's guilty of some of the most grotesque crimes imaginable is now locked up in the same facility with these vulnerable women. It's a disgrace.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, and there are other issues too. Homeless shelters. I mean, there's so much more we could cover
Everywhere.
there.
Everywhere.
Everywhere. I mean,
Yeah.
it has dominated everything. And in season 3 of Generation Indoctrination, and I just want to pause to tell people, if you're looking for a real recap of this issue, in-depth documentary style podcast, Brandon Show, Generation Indoctrination is a show to listen to. You can find it over at the Christian Post or wherever you listen to your podcast. But you really did a beautiful job of covering a number of issues. You talk about the breaking point, the legislatures across the country sort of revolting on this, that turning point that we're seeing. You also talk about California as really an epicenter, and you get into some of these really heartbreaking stories, the moms and dads that we don't hear from who have gender confused kids and who get trapped in this vicious web. And it's just incredibly heartbreaking. Let's talk a little bit about that, because you are a trained journalist. You are somebody who has looked at this issue in depth. When you hear these stories of the parents that are not being told, well, first of all, what's your reaction to those stories not being told? Why do you think we don't hear from the parents who are languishing as a result of this ideology?
Journalistically, I think it's a tremendous dereliction of duty on the part of our press that it's only in the Christian Post and outlets who are, of our viewpoint, our just sort of theological bent that will give these parents a platform to speak and allow their concerns to be aired. Uh, I think the corporate press, the quote unquote mainstream press, has been tremendously beholden ideologically to the demands of LGBTQ activists, and they will only very cautiously report on it. They won't tell the full story. And so I think it's one of the most hidden and underexposed harms of gender ideology is the family suffering. We saw a lot of people, we've seen increasing coverage in some mainstream outlets about detransitioners who underwent surgeries and they took these cross-sex hormones and blockers and how their bodies were harmed by it. And that's good. But the family rupture and the splintering of family relationships, I think entire books need to be written about that. And in episode 3 of season 3 of our podcast, we speak to two parents in particular, Amy Atterbury and Bill Mahoney, and both of their stories are absolutely devastating. Amy Atterbury's daughter ran away from home as a teenager, took testosterone, got her breasts cut off, her ovaries and uterus cut out, and even had her forearm de-sleeved to make a fake penis as a 19-year-old. And poor Amy had to be in the next room while the doctors conducted this brutal surgery. I can't imagine how torturous that must have been. And Bill Mahoney, who's actually one of the parents profiled in the Dead Name indie documentary, which people can still go see at deadnamedocumentary.com. Clinicians in his case, and this is seen in the documentary, and we talk about it in my podcast, were willing to put his cancer stricken 19-year-old son on cross sex hormones. And we have very compelling evidence of that. His story ends in great tragedy, and I won't give too much away because I hope people go listen to my podcast and go see that film itself. Deadnamedocumentary.com, again, is where you can go see that. But this rips families to shreds. The suffering that these moms and dads have endured is pain and agony that they wouldn't wish on their worst enemy. It is you can't even begin to put into words uh, just how many feelings and layers and dimensions of confusion and heartache and sadness manifest in these parents' life when their child is suddenly taken from them and they enter this cult-like contagion, and the medical industrial complex steps in and is willing to disfigure their bodies and drug them to the point where they are, in some cases, permanently sterile. This is the stuff of nightmares. No one, people I talk to about this, they never imagined that growing up in the United States, they would live in a country where doctors would go to work and cut healthy body parts off of children and tell children that they were born in the wrong body and that their parents hate them if they disagree with their supposed gender identities. You couldn't have made anything like this up. Nobody had a grid or a paradigm for this. So we tell their stories in full detail and we don't hold back, we don't sugarcoat in episode 3 of this third season of our podcast. And I hope everyone does go listen to it. They need to hear these stories because it's getting in touch with their pain that I think holds the key to really understanding what's going on and turning the tide even further.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you finish the show with really how Christians and the church should respond to gender ideology. I think that's something a lot of people don't know how to respond because they're hearing everything you just said, they're seeing it, they know it's wrong. They're maybe even just agitated by seeing the pronouns in everybody's profiles. They're trying to understand how this ideology so captured everybody. So it feels so quickly, but it's been a steady, I think, trudge towards where we are now. But as we close out here, what is your advice to people? Obviously, we want them to go listen to the show, but what is your advice to people who are watching this happen and they're feeling like, man, I don't know. I don't know if I want to go out there and be vocal on this. I don't know if I want to be putting myself in the crosshairs. I'm just going to be silent, but they feel conflicted about that. What would you say to them?
I would say that to them that now is the time to show great courage, more than you have ever displayed, because it's going to require that in order to confront the evil that has been unleashed on across our land. I'm not being Chicken Little. And if you think this won't happen to you if you have kids, well, that's what every mom and dad tells me when they call me or email me in desperation as they are forced into this world of nightmares that they never even knew existed. If you find out about what's going on and you have connected the dots that it's really as bad as I'm saying, and you've seen this probably in other cases, if you followed some of the stories of these detransitioners, you know that what I'm saying is true. And so my advice is that you, especially if you are a believing Christian, is that you seek the Lord, and whatever you sense the Holy Spirit telling you to do, just do that and do it with gusto. This is one of the worst medical scandals that the world has ever seen. This is tearing apart families. And if you're committed to justice and to truth, I think it behooves us all to do something. And so, whatever your skill set or your gift mix is, just do what you're able to do. But I think, as Russ Douthat put it in the New York Times a while ago, he's one of their conservative columns. He said, for those who are being silent about this, and I'm paraphrasing, or pretty close, he said, your silence will soon be your regret. I don't think you want history to go by, and when this is all shaken out, for you to have your conscience and say that I wish I would have said something when I needed to. Please start to speak out, because it's really empowering when you start to speak truthfully. And you'll find, I think, especially that though you might be canceled and though you might be hated, it's really worth it to tell the truth. And it really does pay off in the end. That's not a cliche. It's really true. Um, and we need to speak up for children. That's just, I think there's so many harms of gender ideology, but If you're a Christian, the Lord Jesus Christ loves children, and he has very strong words for those who lead them astray and put them in harm's way. Speak up for the kids. They're hurting. And I know I won't have it on my conscience to see a generation of kids confused and sterilized and surgically maimed. Not on my watch, not one more.
Well, and you have been on the front lines of this issue. Brandon Showalter, appreciate you taking the time today and joining us.
Thank you, Billy. Good to be here as always.
Everyone else, make sure you head on over to Generation Indoctrination. That is the show. You can listen to it, and be sure to head over to Higher Ground. You can see podcasts, stories, and so much more over at the Washington Times Higher Ground. We will see you again next week.